In the vast darkness between stars, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that echoes through every corner of the galaxy. Never underestimate a species that remembers kindness as clearly as betrayal. The Galactic Council learned this lesson when they dismissed humanity as primitive, emotional creatures unworthy of consideration. They witnessed it when those same primitive beings mobilized fleets that could crack planets in half. But the real shock came when they discovered that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their numbers, it was their memory. A memory that stretched back 300 years to a single act of compassion from a dying alien race. A memory that would reshape the balance of power across 1,000 worlds. This is the story of how gratitude became genocide, how loyalty became legend, and how humanity proved that some debts can only be paid in the currency of entire civilizations. The emergency beacon cut through space like a scream in the void. Its signal, weak but desperate. Captain Sarah Chen gripped the armrests of her command chair as the distress call translated across her bridge speakers, the words scratching through layers of static and interference. This is Research Vessel Meridian. Catastrophic system failure. Life support failing. Any ship in range, please respond. The message repeated, growing fainter with each transmission. Sarah's tactical officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, looked up from his console with grim efficiency. Captain, the signal is coming from the Kepler 442 system, approximately 6 light-years from our current position. Based on signal degradation, I estimate we have maybe 18 hours before their life support fails completely. Sarah studied the star chart displayed on the main screen. Kepler 442 was deep in uncharted space, far from any established shipping lanes or colonial territories. Whatever ship was out there had either made a terrible navigation error or was running from something serious. Either way, they were about to die alone in the dark. Time to intercept at maximum burn? She asked. 16 hours, 43 minutes, came the reply from her navigation officer. But Captain, we're currently carrying medical supplies for the Proxima Station outbreak. If we divert now, those colonists won't get their medicines for another week. The weight of command pressed down on Sarah's shoulders like a physical force. 3,000 colonists on Proxima Station were fighting a plague that had already claimed hundreds of lives. Every day of delay meant more deaths, but somewhere in the darkness ahead, people were dying right now. And Earthfleet protocols were clear. No distress call goes unanswered, regardless of circumstances. Plot a course for Kepler 442, maximum burn, Sarah ordered, and send a priority message to Fleet Command. Inform them of our diversion and request immediate medical supply shipment to Proxima Station. The bridge hummed with activity as her crew executed the course change. The UES Defiance, a heavy cruiser built for long-range patrol and rescue operations, turned toward the distant system with all the grace of a predator changing direction mid-hunt. Sarah felt the subtle shift in artificial gravity as the ship's massive engines fired, pushing them toward an unknown fate. Hours passed in tense silence. Sarah had tried to establish communication with the distressed vessel but received no response. Either their communications were completely dead, or there was no one left alive to answer. The thought gnawed at her as she paced the bridge, watching the distance counters slowly tick downward. "Captain!" Rodriguez called out suddenly, his voice sharp with surprise, on detecting multiple energy signatures in the Kepler 442 system. Not just the distressed vessel. There are at least 6 other ships in orbit around the 4th planet. Sarah moved to stand behind his station, studying the sensor readings. Configuration? Unknown, ma'am. The hull materials are unlike anything in our database. Definitely not human, but the energy signatures suggest advanced technology. Weapon systems appear to be significant. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. First contact situations were supposed to be handled by specially trained diplomatic corps, not patrol cruisers carrying medical supplies. But if there were aliens involved in this distress situation, Sarah's options had just become exponentially more complicated. "Red alert," she commanded. "All hands to battle stations. And get me everything you can on those ships. I want to know what we're walking into." The Defiance dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler 442 system 12 hours later. Sarah's first look at the situation confirmed her worst fears and added several new ones she hadn't considered. The research vessel Meridian hung dead in space, its hull breached in multiple locations and venting atmosphere in slowly dissipating clouds. But it wasn't alone. 6 sleek vessels of clearly non-human origin surrounded it in a perfect hexagonal formation, their dark hulls gleaming with an oily iridescence that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it.
"Captain," her communications officer announced, "I'm receiving a transmission from one of the alien vessels."
Audio only, and it's coming through on standard diplomatic frequencies. Put it through. The voice that emerged from the speakers was melodic but cold, each word precisely enunciated with an accent that spoke of vocal cords designed for different purposes than human speech. Unknown human vessel, you have entered hegemony space without authorization. Withdraw immediately, or face the consequences of your intrusion. Sarah squared her shoulders and activated the response channel. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth ship Defiance. We're responding to a distress call from the vessel you have surrounded. Under interstellar maritime law, we have the right to render assistance to ships in distress, regardless of territorial claims. A pause, then a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so utterly devoid of humor. Maritime law? You speak of primitive customs as if they apply to your betters. The vessel contains criminals who violated hegemony territory. They are being processed according to our justice system. Leave now, and you will not share their fate. Sarah glanced at Rodriguez, who was running intensive scans on the Meridian. He shook his head grimly. No life signs detected. Whether the crew was already dead, or being held on one of the alien ships, there was no way to know without boarding actions. I need to speak with the crew of the Meridian to verify their status, Sarah said into the comm. As representatives of their government, we have that right. You have no rights here, human. This is your final warning. The transmission cut off, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Sarah stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through options. 6 unknown alien warships against 1 Earth cruiser wasn't exactly favorable odds, but the Defiance was no merchant vessel. She carried enough firepower to level a small moon, and her crew had trained for exactly these kinds of situations. Ma'am, Rodriguez said quietly, I'm detecting power fluctuations in the alien vessel's weapon systems. They're charging up. Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before combat, the clarity of mind that had kept her alive through 3 major fleet actions. Launch 2 reconnaissance drones towards the Meridian. I want to know what happened to that crew, and warm up our weapon systems, but don't target anything yet. Let's see if they're bluffing. The drones shot forward small and fast enough to evade most targeting systems. For a moment, it looked like the aliens might let them pass. Then space lit up with energy beams that turned both drones into expanding clouds of superheated metal. Well, Sarah said with deadly calm, I guess we know where they stand. Rodriguez, target their weapons arrays. Let's see how tough these ships really are. The first exchange of fire lasted exactly 43 seconds and changed the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The alien vessels, despite their advanced technology, had made a crucial error in judgment. They had assumed that humanity's single ship represented the extent of human military capability in the region. They were wrong. Sarah had spent 15 years in Earthfleet, fighting pirates in the Outer Rim and participating in the brutal colonial wars. She knew how to take apart an enemy formation, and more importantly, she knew how to do it fast. The Defiance's opening salvo was a thing of beauty, perfectly coordinated particle beams and kinetic projectiles that struck 3 alien vessels simultaneously. The result was spectacular. 2 of the ships simply vanished in brilliant explosions that lit up the system like twin suns. The third lost power and began tumbling through space, its hull cracked open like an eggshell. The remaining 3 ships responded with their own weapons, exotic energy beams that made space itself seem to ripple and tear. But Sarah was already moving, the Defiance dancing between enemy fire with an agility that belied its massive size. Her return fire was methodical, professional, and utterly devastating. Within minutes, all 6 alien vessels were either destroyed or disabled, their wreckage drifting in expanding clouds around the dead Meridian. Damage report, Sarah called out as the bridge returned to normal lighting. Minor hull, scoring on decks 7 and 12, came the response. No casualties, minimal system damage. We got off light, Captain. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already moving to the next problem. Those ships had to belong to somebody, and that somebody was probably not going to be happy about losing 6 warships to a single human cruiser. More importantly, there was still the matter of the Meridian's crew. Launch a boarding pod to the research vessel. I want to know what happened over there. And send a message to Fleet Command Priority 1. We need to report first contact with a hostile alien species. The boarding team's report came back 3 hours later, and it changed everything. The Meridian's crew of 47 researchers and support staff had been taken alive, transported to the alien vessels before Sarah's arrival. But, more importantly, the research vessel's computers contained detailed records of what they had been doing in this system. Dr. Amanda Foster, the Meridian's chief xenobiologist, had made a discovery that would reshape humanity's understanding of life in the galaxy. The fourth planet of the Kepler 442 system was home to a dying civilization, a species called the HFY, who had been fighting a losing battle against a genetic plague for over a century. The Meridian had arrived just as the last HFY settlements were failing. Instead of observing from a distance as regulations required, Dr. Foster had made a decision that violated every first contact protocol in the book. She had landed on the planet and offered humanity's help. For 6 months, the Meridian's crew had worked alongside the HFY, sharing medical knowledge and technology in a desperate attempt to save their species. They had made progress, developing treatments that could extend HFY lifespans and even reverse some of the genetic damage. But they had also attracted the attention of something much worse than a natural plague. The hegemony, according to the Meridian's records, was a collection of species that viewed the galaxy as their personal property. They enforced a strict non-interference policy on primitive civilizations, and they considered humanity to be very primitive indeed. The HFY had been designated a failing species, marked for natural extinction. Human interference was not just unwelcome, it was considered a crime against galactic order. Sarah read the reports with growing anger. The HFY had been grateful beyond measure for humanity's help, offering in return something that no amount of money could buy: detailed information about galactic civilization, including star charts, political structures, and most importantly, the location of major hegemony military installations. The alien ships Sarah had destroyed weren't just enforcers, they were slavers, sent to capture the human crew and bring them back for justice. That would likely involve public execution as an example to other primitive species. The fact that they had failed to capture anyone was about to become a very serious problem for humanity. But as Sarah studied the HFY star charts, comparing them to humanity's own limited maps of local space, she began to see possibilities that the hegemony had never considered. Humanity might be primitive by galactic standards, but they were far from helpless. And now, thanks to Dr. Foster's violation of protocol, they had something they had never possessed before: detailed intelligence about their enemies. The message from Fleet Command arrived 18 hours later, and its contents would have been amusing if the situation hadn't been so serious. Admiral Harrison's normally calm voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic as he delivered orders that Sarah had been expecting. Captain Chen, you are ordered to maintain position and establish a defensive perimeter around the Kepler 442 system. The 7th Fleet is en route to your position and will arrive in approximately 72 hours. Under no circumstances are you to engage in further hostile actions unless directly attacked. This is now a matter of planetary security. Sarah almost laughed. Planetary security was an understatement. Based on the HFY intelligence, the hegemony controlled approximately 3,000 star systems and commanded military forces that made Earth's entire fleet look like a collection of patrol boats. Humanity had just kicked a hornet's nest the size of a solar system, and the hornets were definitely going to come looking for payback. But as she prepared her ship for what was likely to be the longest 72 hours of her life, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. The HFY were gone now. Their species extinct after a century-long battle against impossible odds. But in their final months, they had experienced something that the hegemony could never understand: hope. Dr. Komet. Foster and her crew had given them that hope, and in return, the HFY had given humanity something far more valuable than star charts or technical data. They had given them the knowledge that they were not alone in their defiance of galactic tyranny. The Defiant settled into a defensive orbit around the dead planet below, her sensors scanning constantly for signs of incoming vessels. Sarah knew they would come. The hegemony couldn't allow the destruction of 6 warships to go unanswered, especially not by a species they considered barely above animals in intelligence. Let them come, Sarah thought as she watched the stars wheel overhead. Humanity had survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and the harsh realities of interstellar expansion. They had built their civilization on the principle that every life had value, that no one should die alone in the dark if there was any possibility of help. The hegemony was about to learn what that principle meant when applied to interstellar warfare, and somewhere in the wreckage of alien ships drifting through space around them, the last gift of a dying species waited to change the course of galactic history forever. The hegemony response arrived exactly 68 hours after Sarah's engagement, emerging from hyperspace like angry gods descending from Mount Olympus. 24 vessels materialized in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the same oily iridescence as the ships Sarah had destroyed, but these were larger, more heavily armed, and radiating the kind of menace that made experienced warriors take notice. Admiral Rebecca Harrison's 7th Fleet had arrived 30 minutes earlier, turning the empty space around Kepler 142 into humanity's largest military staging area outside the Sol system. 12 heavy cruisers, 6 battleships, and the flagship dreadnought UES Retribution formed a defensive sphere around the planet, their weapons trained on the approaching alien fleet. Sarah watched from the Defiance's bridge as the two forces faced each other across the void. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The hegemony fleet outgunned humanity's ships by approximately 3-1, with technology that was centuries more advanced. If this turned into a shooting war, the 7th Fleet would be lucky to take down half the enemy ships before being completely annihilated. But Admiral Harrison hadn't come here to start a war. She had come to end one before it could begin. Sarah listened to the communications channel as her commanding officer opened diplomatic contact with the alien fleet. "This is Admiral Rebecca Harrison of the United Earth Fleet. I am authorized to negotiate the peaceful resolution of this incident under the provisions of interstellar law." The response came immediately, delivered in the same coldly melodic voice Sarah had heard before. "I am Fleet Commander Zarthek, of the Hegemony 4th Enforcement Division. You have interfered with lawful hegemony operations and destroyed military vessels engaged in legitimate peacekeeping activities. Your surrender is required for processing under hegemony justice codes." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Peacekeeping activities, as if capturing research scientists who had tried to save a dying species was somehow maintaining galactic order. She activated her command channel to Admiral Harrison's flagship. "Admiral, I've got the complete records from the Meridian. The crew they're demanding had committed no crime other than showing compassion to a species facing extinction. The hegemony was enforcing some kind of non-interference policy that essentially amounts to genocide through neglect." Harrison's response was immediate and professional. "Understood, Captain. Maintain your current position and prepare for possible engagement. But do not fire unless fired upon." The diplomatic exchange continued for 2 hours, with both sides presenting their cases to an empty universe that cared nothing for the complexities of interstellar law. The hegemony insisted that humanity had violated galactic sovereignty by interfering with designated species under their protection. Admiral Harrison countered that humanity recognized no authority that prevented them from offering aid to beings in distress. It was during the 3rd hour of negotiations that everything changed. Dr. Foster's research team, analyzing the wreckage of the destroyed hegemony ships, made a discovery that would reshape Sarah's understanding of the galaxy's power structure. "Captain," her science officer announced, "we're detecting some unusual energy signatures from the alien wreckage. It appears their ships were powered by a form of contained exotic matter that we've never seen before. But more importantly, we found something else." Sarah moved to the science station, studying the readings on the displays. "Explain." "Ma'am, these ships weren't constructed by the same species. The hull materials show at least 3 different metallurgical techniques. The computer systems use 4 different programming languages. And the weapon systems appear to be a hybrid of technologies from multiple civilizations." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They're not a single species. They're a collection of conquered civilizations forced to work together. "That's our assessment, Captain. And if the energy signatures we're detecting are any indication, some of these technologies were developed by species far more advanced than the ones currently manning these ships." Sarah stared at the tactical display, watching as the two fleets maintained their careful distance. Humanity had always assumed that any alien civilization they encountered would be monolithic, a single species working toward common goals. The reality was far more complex and far more disturbing. The hegemony wasn't just an empire. It was a parasitic organism that consumed entire civilizations, absorbing their knowledge and technology while enslaving their populations. The cold efficiency with which they had moved to stop humanity's aid to the Kethvar wasn't just territorial enforcement. It was protection of their hunting grounds. "Get me Admiral Harrison," Sarah ordered. Priority channel. When the connection opened, Sarah didn't waste time with military protocol. "Admiral, the hegemony isn't what they appear to be. They're not a single species or even a voluntary alliance. They're an empire built on the systematic conquest and enslavement of other civilizations. The ships we destroyed were crewed by multiple species working under coercion."
Admiral Harrison's voice remained calm, but Sarah could hear the tension underneath. "What's your evidence for this assessment, Captain?"
Wreckage analysis shows technology from at least 6 different civilizations integrated into their ships.
Computer systems in 4 different programming languages, metallurgy that suggests multiple industrial bases, and energy signatures that indicate forced technology transfers. "Admiral, They're not here to enforce galactic law. They're here to prevent us from becoming a threat to their expansion. The silence on the channel stretched for 30 seconds before Admiral Harrison responded. Captain Chen, you're relieved of station-keeping duties. I want you to take the Defiance and investigate that dead planet below. If the Kethvar left any records or technology behind, I need to know about it before we make any decisions about how to proceed. Sarah acknowledged the order and began plotting a descent trajectory to the planet's surface. As the Defiance moved out of the main fleet formation, she caught a glimpse of the hegemony vessels adjusting their own positions. They were watching everything, recording every human tactical decision and technological capability. The fourth planet of Kepler. 442 was a graveyard world, its surface scarred by the final desperate attempts of a dying civilization to survive against impossible odds. Sarah led a landing party through abandoned cities where the architecture spoke of minds that thought in 3 dimensions, creating buildings that seemed to flow like frozen waterfalls from earth to sky. The Kethvar had been artists as well as scientists, their settlements combining functional engineering with an aesthetic sensibility that made human cities look crude by comparison. But beauty couldn't protect them from the genetic plague that had slowly strangled their species over the course of a century. Sarah's team found the research facility where Dr. Starban Pepero, Foster's crew, had worked alongside the last surviving Kethvar scientists. The laboratory was exactly as the human researchers had left it, equipment still running, computers still processing data from experiments that would never be completed. But it was the messages they found that changed everything. The Kethvar had known they were dying. They had accepted their fate with a grace that brought tears to Sarah's eyes as she read their final communications. But they had also done something that the hegemony never expected. They had prepared a gift for the species that had shown them kindness in their final hours. Tal Shen, the lead Kethvar scientist, had left a detailed record of his species' encounter with the hegemony 3 centuries earlier. The Kethvar hadn't always been a dying race. They had once commanded an empire of 12 star systems, with technology that rivaled anything the hegemony possessed. But they had made the mistake of believing that rational beings could negotiate with the hegemony as equals. The genetic plague wasn't natural. It was a hegemony bioweapon designed to slowly destroy species that refused to submit to their rule. The Kethvar had fought for 300 years, watching their populations slowly dwindle as each generation became more susceptible to the engineered disease. But Dr. Tal Shen had done more than record his species' history. He had spent his final months analyzing human genetics, comparing them to the plague that had destroyed his people. His conclusions were terrifying in their implications. Humanity was naturally immune to most forms of bioweaponry that affected other galactic species. Their genetic diversity, their evolutionary history of surviving multiple extinction events, and their unusual ability to adapt to hostile environments made them nearly impossible to control through the hegemony's traditional methods. More importantly, Dr. Tal Shen had discovered something about human psychology that the hegemony would never understand. Humans didn't just remember kindness, they repaid it, often at costs that other species would consider irrational. The fact that Dr. Patagoot, Foster's team had risked their lives and careers to help a dying alien species wasn't an anomaly. It was a fundamental aspect of human nature that could be weaponized against an empire built on fear and subjugation. Sarah read Dr. Tal Shen's final entry with growing amazement. The Kethvar scientist had used his species' last months to develop a detailed analysis of hegemony military doctrine, political structure, and technological capabilities. But more than that, he had created a strategic plan specifically designed for humanity to use against their mutual enemies. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The hegemony controlled their empire through a combination of overwhelming force and careful information management. They kept subject species isolated from each other, preventing any coordination that might lead to organized resistance. Their military doctrine relied on rapid deployment of superior firepower to crush any rebellion before it could spread. But they had never faced an enemy like humanity. Humans could survive in environments that would kill most galactic species. They could adapt their technology and tactics faster than any bureaucratic empire could respond. Most importantly, they had something that no hegemony subject species possessed: complete independence and the industrial capacity to wage war on a galactic scale. Dr. Tal Shen's plan called for humanity to become what the hegemony feared most: a rallying point for every oppressed species in the galaxy. Not through conquest or domination, but through the same simple principle that had brought Dr. Foster to the Kethvar homeworld, offering help to those who needed it. Sarah transmitted the complete Kethvar database to Admiral Harrison's flagship, then returned to the surface to pay her respects to the species that had given humanity a roadmap to victory. She stood in the empty laboratory where 2 species had worked together to defy the natural order of galactic civilization and she made a promise that would echo through the centuries to come. The HFY would be remembered. Their sacrifice would not be in vain, and the hegemony would learn that some debts could only be paid with the complete destruction of empires. When Sarah returned to orbit, she found the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The hegemony fleet had moved closer to the human formation, their weapons obviously charging for what appeared to be an imminent attack. But Admiral Harrison wasn't backing down. Instead, she was broadcasting something that made Sarah's heart race with anticipation. This is Admiral Rebecca Harrison of the United Earth Fleet, broadcasting on all frequencies. We have discovered evidence of systematic genocide and slavery being conducted by the organization calling itself the Hegemony. Any species currently under hegemony control who wishes asylum and protection will be granted safe passage to human space. We do not recognize the authority of any organization that enforces compliance through biological warfare and systematic extermination. The response from Fleet Commander Zarthek was immediate and predictably hostile. Admiral Harrison, you have just declared war on a civilization that spans 3,000 star systems. Your species will be extinct within 5 years. Admiral Harrison's reply was delivered in a voice that had commanded fleets through the worst battles in human history. Commander, my species has been fighting extinction for 4 billion years. We're very good at it. But you're about to learn something about humans that your intelligence files probably don't mention. When we make friends, we keep them. And when someone hurts our friends, we make sure it never happens again. The first shots of the Hegemony War were fired 60 seconds later when Zartek's fleet opened fire on the human formation. But Sarah was already moving, the Defiance accelerating toward the enemy ships with all the fury of a species that had just learned they were not alone in the universe. The battle that followed would be remembered as the moment when humanity announced its arrival on the galactic stage. Not as conquerors or rulers, but as the one species crazy enough to fight for strangers who couldn't fight for themselves. As energy beams lit up the space between the two fleets, Sarah thought about Dr. Talshin's final message, which had been addressed specifically to whoever found it. The message was simple, heartfelt, and would become humanity's battle cry for the next 300 years. Thank you for not letting us die alone. Now go show the galaxy what it means to have humans as friends. The galaxy was about to find out. The Battle of Kepler 442 lasted 6 hours and changed the course of galactic history. When the smoke cleared and the last hegemony ship tumbled through space as an expanding cloud of superheated debris, Admiral Harrison found herself in command of the largest collection of alien prisoners of war in human history. Sarah stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching as shuttles ferried survivors from the destroyed hegemony vessels to makeshift detention facilities aboard the human ships. What they were discovering challenged every assumption humanity had made about their new enemies. The prisoners weren't a single species. They weren't even willing collaborators. The crews of the hegemony ships represented 7 different civilizations, most of whom had been fighting each other under hegemony orders. The ship commanders were members of a species called the Sector, aggressive reptilian beings who served as the hegemony's military leadership. But the technical specialists, engineers and support staff were clearly from other worlds, other cultures, other evolutionary paths entirely. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the 7th Fleet's chief xenobiologist, had spent 3 days interviewing prisoners before she compiled her report. Sarah read it in her ready room, while the fleet maintained position around the dead HFY world, and what she learned made her understand why the hegemony was so terrified of human expansion. Captain, Dr. Vasquez had written, the hegemony is not a traditional empire. It's a carefully constructed system of mutual hostility, designed to prevent any subject species from uniting against their rulers. Each species is given specific enemies to hate, specific territories to defend, and specific technologies to develop. They're kept in a constant state of controlled conflict that prevents them from recognizing their common oppressor. The genius of the system was its simplicity. The Sectar hated the Vortai because the hegemony had given them conflicting territorial claims. The Vortai despised the Klelnan because their technologies were deliberately designed to be incompatible. The Klelnan feared the Zeftik because they had been told that Zeftik philosophy was an existential threat to their way of life. But when human interrogators removed the hegemony control implants that regulated prisoner behavior, something remarkable happened. The hatred began to fade, replaced by confusion, then understanding, then a rage that made even experienced soldiers step back in alarm. These species had been at war for centuries, believing they were fighting for survival, honor, or ideological principles. Instead, they had been puppets dancing to strings pulled by a hidden puppet master who fed on their conflicts. The knowledge that their children had died for lies, that their civilizations had been destroyed for someone else's entertainment, created a fury that transcended species boundaries. Sarah was reviewing prisoner interrogation reports when her communications officer announced an incoming message from Earth. President Martinez's face appeared on her main screen, and Sarah could see the strain of the past week written in every line of her features. Captain Chen, I'm transmitting new orders from Fleet Command. The situation here has become complex. That was an understatement. Within hours of Admiral Harrison's declaration, refugee ships had begun appearing at the edges of human space. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Entire species were abandoning their homeworlds rather than remain under hegemony control, following hastily downloaded star charts toward the one civilization that had promised to protect them. Earth's colonies were suddenly hosting the largest refugee crisis in galactic history. Beings who breathed methane, creatures that lived in zero gravity, silicon-based life forms that communicated through electromagnetic radiation, all of them fleeing toward human space with nothing but desperate hope in the knowledge that humans had once shown kindness to the Kethvar. We're establishing refugee processing centers on 47 different worlds, President Martinez continued. But Captain, this isn't just a humanitarian crisis. These species are bringing intelligence about hegemony operations that's beyond anything we could have imagined. The scope of their empire, their military capabilities, their industrial capacity. We're not just at war with a collection of species. We're fighting a machine that's been consuming civilizations for over 2,000 years. Sarah nodded grimly. The interrogations had revealed similar information. The hegemony wasn't just large, it was ancient. They had perfected their system of control over millennia, destroying hundreds of species and absorbing thousands more. Their current empire encompassed nearly 10% of the galaxy, with industrial facilities that could produce warships faster than entire solar systems could be colonized. Ma'am, what are our orders regarding the prisoners? President Martinez smiled for the first time since the conversation began. That's where things get interesting, Captain. We're not treating them as prisoners of war anymore. As of this morning, they're political refugees who have requested asylum from an oppressive regime. Dr. Vasquez reports confirm that most of them were acting under technological compulsion rather than free will. The implications were staggering. By reclassifying the prisoners as refugees, humanity had just gained access to technical specialists from 7 different advanced civilizations. More importantly, they had gained allies who understood hegemony technology, tactics, and psychology better than any human analysis could provide. Captain, the President continued, your new mission is to take the Defiance and begin what we're calling the Liberation Campaign. Use the intelligence we've gathered to identify hegemony facilities with minimal defenses and start freeing their work camps. Every species we liberate becomes a potential ally. Every facility we capture gives us more intelligence about their operations. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just military action. It was a complete transformation of humanity's role in galactic civilization. Instead of hiding on the edges of known space, they were about to begin actively dismantling an empire that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. What about reinforcements, ma'am? The hegemony isn't going to let us pick apart their empire without responding. The refugee species are already helping with that problem, Captain. It turns out that several of them have industrial capabilities that complement our own. The Vorthe are natural engineers who can adapt our manufacturing processes to their own designs. The Klelnan have developed energy technologies that could double the effectiveness of our weapons. Most importantly, the Zeftik have something we've never possessed. Detailed maps of every hegemony installation within 500 light years of our current position. Sarah studied the star charts that accompanied the President's message. The hegemony's empire looked like a vast cancer spread across the galaxy, with thousands of systems connected by carefully maintained supply lines and communication networks. But the Zeftik maps revealed something that human intelligence had never suspected. The empire's apparent strength was also its greatest weakness. The hegemony maintained control through a complex system of interdependent facilities. Each sector depended on specific industrial centers for equipment, certain agricultural worlds for food, particular research stations for technological development. Break enough links in the chain, and entire sectors would collapse from simple inability to maintain themselves. Captain, President Martinez said, you're looking at the target list for the first phase of operations. 12 systems, all lightly defended, all critical to hegemony operations in this sector. Take them out, and you'll cripple their ability to respond to refugee movements in this entire region. Sarah studied the target list with professional interest. Most were industrial facilities or research stations, defended by small garrisons that would be overwhelmed by a single human heavy cruiser. But attacking them would require careful timing and coordination. The hegemony would respond to each attack, and their response forces would grow stronger with each engagement. Ma'am, I'll need more than one ship for this kind of operation. You're getting them, Captain. Admiral Harrison is taking half the 7th Fleet back to human space to coordinate refugee operations and prepare for the hegemony's inevitable counterattack. You're getting the other half, plus several refugee ships that have volunteered to join your task force. The refugee volunteers turned out to be more valuable than Sarah had anticipated. The Vorthe contributed 3 ships with engineering capabilities that put human technology to shame. The Klaunan provided vessels with sensor arrays that could detect hegemony ships across multiple star systems. Most importantly, the Zeftic offered something that no human commander had ever possessed: complete cultural knowledge of their enemies. Captain Veltar of the Zeftic vessel Harmony's Edge was a being who looked like a cross between a dolphin and a butterfly, with translucent wings that shimmered with patterns that conveyed emotional states. She had spent 40 years as a hegemony naval officer before the liberation of her ship's crew, and her knowledge of enemy tactics was encyclopedic. Commander Chen, Veltar said during their first strategy meeting, her translated voice carrying harmonics that spoke of barely controlled fury. The hegemony expects resistance to follow predictable patterns. They assume that any rebellion will focus on military targets, attempting to match their strength with inferior forces. They do not anticipate attacks designed to cause systemic failure rather than immediate damage. Sarah studied the tactical displays that showed their first target, a hegemony industrial complex in the Rigel sector that manufactured the control implants used to regulate subject species. Destroying the facility wouldn't significantly impact their military capability, but it would prevent the creation of new slaves across an entire sector. What kind of defenses are we looking at? Minimum, Veltar replied. The facility is located in a system that has been under hegemony control for 300 years. They expect no resistance from local populations, and their nearest military base is 2 days' travel away at maximum speed. 4 patrol ships, orbital defense platforms that are primarily designed to prevent smuggling rather than military attack. Sarah nodded. It was exactly the kind of target that would teach the hegemony that their empire was far more vulnerable than they had ever imagined. More importantly, it would send a message to every oppressed species in the sector. Humanity was here to help, and they were here to stay. The Liberation campaign began 3 weeks later with a simultaneous attack on all 12 target systems. Sarah led the assault on the Rigel facility personally, watching as the Defiance and her escorts dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation around the industrial complex. The attack lasted 47 minutes from first contact to complete facility destruction. The hegemony defenders had clearly never faced an enemy that combined human tactical flexibility with alien technological superiority. Sarah's task force moved through the system like a surgical instrument, eliminating threats with minimal collateral damage while carefully preserving the infrastructure needed by local populations. But it was what happened after the attack that truly demonstrated the campaign's revolutionary nature. Instead of withdrawing immediately, Sarah's force remained in the system for 2 weeks, providing medical aid to local populations, repairing infrastructure damage, and most importantly, removing hegemony control implants from anyone who requested the procedure. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These populations had lived under hegemony rule for generations, believing that resistance was impossible and freedom was a luxury reserved for their masters. Suddenly, they were being helped by aliens who asked for nothing in return except the chance to end their suffering. Within days, the entire sector was in chaos. Not the destructive chaos that the hegemony used to maintain control, but the creative chaos of people who had suddenly remembered what it meant to be free. Populations that had been enemies for centuries began sharing resources and information. Technical specialists who had been forced to develop weapons began designing tools for construction and healing. Most importantly, they began joining Sarah's Liberation Fleet in numbers that astonished even her most optimistic projections. By the end of the first month, her task force had grown from 12 ships to over 200, representing 43 different species that had chosen to join humanity's war against their mutual oppressors. The hegemony's response was predictable and devastating. They deployed 3 full battle fleets to crush the rebellion, with orders to make examples that would discourage any further resistance. What they found instead was an enemy that had learned to fight like humans, with improvisation, adaptation, and a complete disregard for conventional tactical doctrine. Sarah watched from the bridge of the Defiance as the largest space battle in galactic history unfolded around the Vega system. 300 hegemony warships faced off against 500 liberation vessels, but the numbers told only part of the story. Sarah's fleet was crewed by beings who were fighting for their freedom, their families, and their futures. The hegemony ships were crewed by slaves fighting for masters they had never seen. The battle lasted 3 days and ended with the complete destruction of the hegemony force. But more importantly, it established a pattern that would define the next phase of the war. Every hegemony defeat produced new refugees, new allies, and new intelligence about additional targets. As Sarah stood on her bridge, watching the wreckage of an empire's arrogance drift through space around her, she remembered Dr. Talshin's final message. The Kefar scientist had known that his gift to humanity would change the galaxy forever. He had given them something more valuable than technology or intelligence. He had given them hope, and hope, Sarah was learning, was the most contagious force in the universe. 2 years after the Battle of Kepler 442, the galaxy had transformed into something unrecognizable. What had begun as humanity's response to a single distress call had evolved into the largest liberation movement in galactic history. The hegemony, which had ruled through fear and controlled isolation for over 2 millennia, was discovering that their empire was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. Sarah Chen, now Admiral Chen, stood on the command deck of the UES Liberation, humanity's first purpose-built coalition warship. The vessel was a testament to what could be accomplished when dozens of species pooled their knowledge and resources. Vorthay engineering had created a hull that could withstand weapons fire that would vaporize conventional ships. Plelnan energy systems provided power output that defied human understanding of physics. Zeftic navigation computers could plot courses through hyperspace that cut travel time by 70%. But it was the ship's crew that truly represented the revolution taking place across the galaxy. Humans worked alongside beings so alien that first contact protocols had required complete revision. Species that had been engineered to hate each other for centuries now shared duties, meals, and increasingly, a common purpose that transcended their individual origins. Admiral, announced Commander Theknol, her sector tactical officer. We're receiving transmission from the hegemony core worlds. It appears to be a formal diplomatic communication. Sarah raised an eyebrow. The sector had been the hegemony's primary military commanders, genetically modified for aggression and loyalty. But like so many others, Theknol had volunteered for liberation surgery that removed his control implants, revealing the person beneath the programming. The transition hadn't been easy, but few transformations worth making ever were. Put it through, Commander. The holographic projection that materialized above the command platform showed a being that Sarah had never seen before. Tall, ethereal, with features that seemed to shift between different species' characteristics as she watched. This was clearly one of the hegemony's true rulers rather than their public representatives. I am Prime Arbiter, Zendali, of the Hegemony Central Authority. The being announced in a voice that carried harmonics suggesting multiple vocal cords. I speak for the Council of Ascended Species. You have requested this communication to discuss terms for ending hostilities between our civilizations. Sarah had requested no such thing, but she understood the game being played. The hegemony was finally ready to negotiate, which meant they were finally losing badly enough to consider alternatives to total war.
Prime Arbiter, I'm Admiral Sarah Chen of the Liberation Coalition.
I assume you're here to discuss your surrender. The alien's features shifted in what might have been surprise or amusement.
Admiral Chen, I believe you misunderstand the current situation.
While your rebellion has been impressive, you remain vastly outnumbered by hegemony forces. We are prepared to offer generous terms for the cessation of hostilities and the return of stolen hegemony property. Sarah glanced at the strategic display that dominated one wall of the command center. The current situation was more complex than either side had anticipated. The hegemony still controlled approximately 2,000 star systems, but nearly 800 systems were now in open revolt. More importantly, the rebellion was accelerating rather than slowing down. Every week brought news of new species joining the coalition, new technologies being shared, new victories against hegemony forces that had seemed invincible just months earlier. But the cost was becoming apparent as well. Billions of beings had died in the fighting. Entire worlds had been sterilized by hegemony reprisal attacks, and ancient civilizations had been erased from existence rather than be allowed to choose freedom. Prime Arbiter, Sarah said carefully, what exactly do you consider stolen hegemony property? All species currently under coalition protection are property of the hegemony under laws established through 2,000 years of galactic governance. Their return is non-negotiable. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, which Sarah supposed they were. Around the command center, she could feel her crew's reaction to the casual dismissal of their personhood. These beings had fought and died for the right to be considered something other than property, and the hegemony's opening negotiation position was that this right didn't exist. "I see," Sarah said with deadly calm. "And what does the hegemony offer in exchange for returning what you consider your property?" "Humanity will be granted protected status as a developing species. You will be allowed to maintain your current territorial holdings under hegemony oversight, with full autonomy over internal affairs. Your technological development will be monitored and guided to prevent dangerous experimentation. In exchange, you will return all stolen assets and cease interference with hegemony governance." Sarah looked around the command center at the faces of beings from 43 different species. They had come from worlds across the galaxy, fleeing oppression, slavery, and systematic extermination. They had fought beside humanity not because they were forced to, but because for the first time in their lives they had been given a choice. "Prime Arbiter, I'm afraid your terms are unacceptable. The beings you refer to as property are free citizens of their respective worlds. They cannot be returned because they were never stolen."
They chose to leave. The alien's features shifted again, this time clearly displaying irritation.
Admiral, perhaps you do not understand the scope of forces you are challenging.
"The hegemony commands military assets across 3,000 star systems. Your coalition represents a fraction of our industrial capacity. This rebellion can be crushed at any time we choose to deploy our full resources." "Then why haven't you?" The question seemed to catch the Prime Arbiter off guard.
For several seconds, the hologram remained motionless while Zendali presumably consulted with other hegemony leaders. When the response came, it revealed more about their enemy's situation than Sarah had hoped to learn through conventional intelligence gathering.
"The hegemony prefers to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than unnecessary destruction of useful assets. However, if diplomacy fails, we are prepared to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance." The transmission ended, leaving Sarah's command center in thoughtful silence. After 2 years of fighting, this was the first time the hegemony had attempted diplomatic contact. Either they were finally taking the rebellion seriously, or they were preparing for something that required advance warning. "Admiral," Commander Veltar said from her position at the sensor station, "I believe the Prime Arbiter was attempting to determine our current military capabilities." Several of her questions seemed designed to elicit information about Coalition fleet strength and deployment. Sarah nodded. The Zeftic had evolved sophisticated abilities to read emotional and psychological states through subtle environmental cues. Veltar's insights into alien motivations had proven invaluable throughout the campaign. "What's your assessment of their actual situation?" "They are losing, Admiral. More importantly, they know they are losing. The hegemony has never faced sustained resistance from multiple species simultaneously. Their entire governmental structure is designed to prevent exactly this kind of coalition from forming. They are afraid." The idea that the hegemony could experience fear was almost as revolutionary as the rebellion itself. For 2 millennia, they had been the galaxy's ultimate predator, consuming civilizations with the confidence of beings who had never encountered effective resistance. The concept that they might be vulnerable to the same emotions that plagued their victims had never occurred to most of their subjects. But Sarah was beginning to understand that fear might be the key to ending this war without destroying half the galaxy in the process. The hegemony ruled through terror, but terror was only effective as long as the victims believed their oppressors were invincible. Once that illusion shattered, the entire system would collapse. "Commander Thacknell, I want you to analyze the Prime Arbiter's transmission for technological signatures. If the hegemony is planning something special, I want to know about it before they surprise us." The sector's analysis revealed something disturbing. The transmission had been routed through 17 different relay stations before reaching the Liberation Fleet, each using different encryption protocols and technological standards. More importantly, the routing pattern suggested that the hegemony was no longer using their primary communication networks for sensitive military communications. "Admiral," Thacknell reported, "this message was transmitted using backup systems designed for emergency use only. Either their primary networks are compromised, or they are attempting to hide communications from their own subjects. Both possibilities were troubling. If coalition forces had successfully infiltrated hegemony communication networks, it would explain their recent tactical successes, but would also make them a target for massive retaliation. If the hegemony was hiding communications from their own people, it suggested they were planning operations that even their subject species would find objectionable." The answer came 3 days later, when long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures from the direction of the hegemony core worlds. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now the Coalition's chief scientific advisor, spent 6 hours analyzing the readings before requesting an immediate meeting with Sarah's command staff. "Admiral," she announced grimly, "the hegemony is preparing to use something we've never seen before. The energy signatures suggest they're powering up some kind of massive installation, possibly a weapon system with planetary-scale destructive capability." Sarah felt cold understanding wash over her. "They're building a demonstration. Something so devastating that every species in the galaxy will be too terrified to continue resisting." "That's our assessment, Admiral. Based on the power requirements we're detecting, this weapon could sterilize entire star systems. If they use it against one of our major population centers, it would kill billions of beings and prove that resistance to hegemony rule is futile." Sarah stared at the strategic display, watching as updated intelligence painted a picture of the galaxy's new reality. The liberation movement had succeeded beyond humanity's wildest expectations, freeing hundreds of species and establishing the first truly free zone in galactic history. But success had made them a target for the kind of retaliation that could end civilization itself.
How long until this weapon is operational? Unknown, Admiral.
But based on the construction patterns we're observing, I estimate they need at least 6 months to complete the installation. Possibly longer if they encounter technical difficulties. 6 months. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, calculating odds and resources with the efficiency that had kept her alive through dozens of space battles. 6 months to either negotiate a peaceful resolution to a galactic war or prepare for a conflict that would determine the future of every intelligent species in the galaxy. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to work with our alien technical specialists to develop countermeasures for this weapon. Even if we can't stop it completely, we need to be able to protect our most important population centers." Admiral Commander Veltar interjected. "There may be another option." The Zeftic maintained detailed historical records of hegemony technology development. "It is possible that this weapon is not entirely new, but rather an upgraded version of systems they have used before." The historical records proved to be a revelation. The hegemony had indeed built similar weapons in the past, using them to end rebellions that had grown too large to suppress through conventional military action. But each previous use had required sacrifices that even the hegemony found difficult to justify. The weapons consumed enormous amounts of resources, required the labor of entire species to construct, and most importantly, could only be used against targets that posed no significant threat to galactic civilization. Using such a weapon against the Liberation Coalition would risk triggering exactly the kind of systemic collapse that had kept the hegemony from deploying it earlier. They're gambling, Sarah realized. They're betting that one demonstration will be enough to end the rebellion before it spreads further. If they're wrong, if we refuse to surrender after they use their weapon, they'll have committed resources they can't spare for a conflict they can't afford to lose.
Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. V. Hellman.
Tal Shen and the final message he had left for humanity. The HFY scientist had understood something about the hegemony that even their subjects had never grasped. They were not as strong as they appeared. Their empire was built on illusion as much as force, and illusions could be shattered by beings brave enough to refuse to believe them. The galaxy was about to discover whether courage was enough to defeat a weapon that could crack worlds in half. The hegemony's demonstration came exactly 5 months and 12 days after Prime Arbiter Zendali's diplomatic overture. Admiral Sarah Chen watched from the bridge of the UES Liberation as long-range sensors recorded the complete annihilation of the HFY homeworld, the same planet where humanity had first learned about galactic civilization. The weapon that destroyed Kepler. 442b was unlike anything in human experience. Rather than explosive destruction, the planet simply ceased. One moment it existed as a scarred but recognizable world, the next it was an expanding cloud of component atoms scattered across space like cosmic dust. No explosion, no debris field, no trace that billions of years of geological history had ever existed. The message that accompanied the demonstration was broadcast across every inhabited system in the galaxy, delivered in the languages of 3,000 different species. This is the fate that awaits any world that harbors enemies of galactic order. The hegemony's patience has ended. Submit now, or share this world's destiny. Sarah's command center had gone silent as the weapon's effects became clear. Around her, beings from dozens of species struggled to comprehend the magnitude of destruction they had just witnessed. This wasn't military force, or even strategic bombardment. This was the power to erase entire worlds from existence, leaving nothing but empty space where civilizations had once flourished. Admiral, whispered Commander Thechnol, his normally steady voice shaking. My species has legends about weapons like this. We called them world enders, myths from the earliest days of hegemony rule. I never believed they were real. Doctor, Elena Vasquez spoke from her position at the science station, her voice professionally calm despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. The energy readings suggest some kind of matter conversion process, possibly operating at the quantum level.
They're not destroying the planet so much as converting it into its component energy.
The technical requirements for a weapon like this, she trailed off, clearly struggling to process the implications.
Sarah understood the difficulty. Humanity had always known they were fighting against superior technology, but this was beyond superior. This was technology that approached the theoretical limits of what physical law would permit. How many worlds could they destroy with this weapon? Sarah asked. Unknown, Admiral. But based on the energy requirements we observed, I estimate they could target one planet every 2 to 3 months, possibly longer if they encounter technical limitations. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The Liberation Coalition currently controlled or protected approximately 800 star systems, many containing multiple inhabited worlds. If the hegemony could destroy one world every few months, they could systematically erase every trace of the rebellion over the course of several decades. But as Sarah studied the tactical displays showing the galaxy's new reality, she began to see possibilities that the hegemony might have overlooked. The weapon that could destroy planets could only target one world at a time, and its power requirements were clearly enormous. More importantly, using it required the hegemony to make choices about which civilizations deserved to die. Choices that would be broadcast across the galaxy for every subject species to witness. Commander Veltar, Sarah called. What's the psychological impact of this demonstration on hegemony subject species? The Zeftic officer consulted her emotional analysis computers, reviewing communication intercepts from across hegemony space. Her response revealed the flaw in their enemy's strategy. Admiral, the immediate reaction is terror, as intended. But underneath the fear, we're detecting something else. Many species are questioning why the hegemony chose to destroy the Cathvar homeworld specifically. They're beginning to understand that this weapon can be used against anyone, including them. Sarah felt the first stirring of hope since the demonstration began. The hegemony had always maintained control by convincing subject species that cooperation would ensure their survival, but a weapon that could erase entire worlds made cooperation irrelevant. If the hegemony could destroy planets at will, then loyalty offered no protection against annihilation. They've broken their own system, Sarah realized. For 2,000 years, they've maintained control by offering subject species a choice between submission and destruction. But this weapon proves that submission doesn't guarantee survival. If they'll destroy an empty world to make a point, they'll destroy anything. The communication that changed everything arrived 6 hours after the demonstration. The message came from deep within hegemony space, transmitted using codes that Dr. Vasquez identified as belonging to the hegemony's own military leadership. Liberation Coalition Command. This is Fleet Marshal Doc Tharan of the Hegemony 5th Strategic Division. We request immediate communication for purposes of discussing mutual cooperation against common enemies. Sarah stared at the message transmission data with growing amazement. Fleet Marshal Doc Tharan wasn't just any hegemony officer. According to intelligence files, he commanded nearly 300 warships and controlled military operations across 74 star systems. If he was attempting to contact the coalition, it meant the hegemony's own military was fracturing. The communication that followed was conducted through a complex series of encrypted relays designed to prevent detection by hegemony intelligence services. When Fleet Marshal Doc Tharan's image finally appeared on Sarah's command screen, she found herself looking at a being whose entire existence represented the contradictions of hegemony rule. Doc Tharan was a Vorthe, one of the engineering species that had provided technical support to Sarah's liberation fleet. But unlike the refugees who had joined the coalition voluntarily, the Fleet Marshal bore the distinctive scars of advanced hegemony modifications. Neural implants covered half his skull, genetic modifications had enhanced his physical capabilities far beyond natural limits, and his eyes held the flat shine that indicated direct technological interface with his ship's command systems. Admiral Chen, he began without preamble. I speak for 17 fleet marshals commanding approximately 4,200 warships across hegemony space. We are prepared to transfer our allegiance to the Liberation Coalition under specific conditions. Sarah felt her heart race. 4,200 hegemony warships represented more firepower than the coalition had managed to assemble in 2 years of warfare. If these officers were serious about defection, it would shift the balance of power so dramatically that the war could end within months. What conditions, Fleet Marshal?
The weapon that destroyed the Kethvar homeworld is controlled by the Hegemony Central Authority without input from military leadership. We were not consulted about its deployment, nor were we informed of its existence until after the demonstration. This represents a fundamental change in hegemony governance that we cannot accept. Sarah began to understand the deeper implications of the hegemony's strategic error. Their military commanders had always believed they were partners in galactic governance, not just tools to be used and discarded. The planet killer weapon proved that the Central Authority viewed even their own officers as expendable assets rather than valued allies. Fleet Marshal, what exactly are you proposing? Joint military action against the weapon installation, followed by coordinated liberation of all hegemony-controlled systems. My officers are prepared to provide detailed intelligence about Central Authority military assets, including defensive capabilities and strategic weaknesses. The offer was everything Sarah could have hoped for, but she had learned to be suspicious of gifts that seemed too good to be true. What guarantees can you provide that this isn't a hegemony deception operation? Doc Tharen's response was to transmit a data package that made Dr. Honid, Vasquez gasp audibly. Complete technical specifications for hegemony ship designs, detailed star charts showing the location of every major military installation within 500 light years, and most importantly, real-time intelligence about the planet killer weapon's current operational status. Admiral, Doc Tharen continued. My species has served the hegemony for 800 years. We have built their ships, designed their weapons, and provided the technical expertise that maintains their empire. We did this because we believed we were partners in creating galactic order. The planet killer weapon proves that we are simply the next species to be discarded when our usefulness ends. Sarah studied the intelligence data with growing excitement. The weapon installation was indeed massive, requiring the combined output of 14 star systems to power its operations, but it was also vulnerable in ways that the Central Authority had apparently not considered. The technical specifications revealed multiple critical failure points, and more importantly, several components that required regular maintenance by Vorthai engineering specialists. Fleet Marshal, are your people willing to sabotage the weapon systems they helped create? Admiral, my people designed those systems. We know exactly how to make them fail catastrophically. But we will require coalition support for the operation. The installation is heavily defended, and the Central Authority will certainly attempt to execute anyone involved in sabotage operations. Sarah looked around her command center at the faces of beings who had spent years fighting for the simple right to be free. They had come from across the galaxy, fleeing oppression and slavery, united by humanity's promise that no one should die alone in the dark. Now they had a chance to end the war that had consumed billions of lives and threatened the existence of galactic civilization itself. Fleet Marshal Doc Tharen, the Liberation Coalition accepts your alliance. Transmit your fleet positions and prepare for coordinated operations. We're going to teach the Central Authority what happens when you threaten friends of humanity. The Battle of the Central Core began 3 weeks later with the largest military operation in galactic history. Over 7,000 warships from 47 different species converged on the hegemony's most heavily defended system, where the planet killer weapon hung in space like a technological cancer, feeding on the energy of 14 stars. Sarah commanded the operation from the Liberation, watching as human tactics combined with alien technology created something the galaxy had never seen. A truly cooperative military force where every species contributed their unique strengths to a common purpose. Vorthai engineers provided technical expertise, Klelnan energy specialists powered impossible weapon systems, Zeftic navigators plotted courses through space-time that confused enemy sensors, and dozens of other species added their own capabilities to the Coalition war machine. But it was the defecting hegemony fleets that made victory possible. Fleet Marshal Doc Tharen's forces struck at exactly the right moment, using their insider knowledge to disable defensive systems and create openings for coalition attacks. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a surgical operation, precisely removing the Central Authority's ability to threaten galactic civilization while preserving the infrastructure needed by billions of innocent beings. The planet killer weapon itself was destroyed not by external attack, but by internal sabotage. Vorthai engineers, working with Coalition Special Forces, introduced cascade failures throughout the system's power grid. The weapon that could erase worlds from existence died quietly, its massive installation simply shutting down as their energy sources were systematically disconnected. Sarah stood on her bridge as the battle ended, watching as the largest concentration of hegemony military power in the galaxy surrendered to a coalition that had begun with a single human ship responding to a distress call. Around her, beings from across the galaxy worked together with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible just years earlier.
The final message of the war came from Prime Arbiter Zendali, transmitted from the Central Authority's capital world as coalition forces entered the system. The being that had once spoken for galactic order now found herself facing the representatives of a new kind of civilization. Admiral Chen, Zendali said, her form shifting between different species characteristics as if seeking some configuration that might inspire sympathy. The Central Authority is prepared to negotiate a peaceful transfer of power. We offer complete autonomy for all liberated systems in exchange for guaranteed safety for hegemony leadership. Sarah's response was delivered with the voice of every species that had ever suffered under hegemony rule. Prime Arbiter, the Liberation Coalition doesn't negotiate with slavers. But we do honor the same principle that started this war. No one dies alone in the dark if we can help it. Surrender unconditionally, submit to trial for crimes against galactic civilization, and you'll receive the same fair treatment we've given every other refugee who's asked for our help. The hegemony fell not with violence but with simple justice. War crime tribunals were established on dozens of worlds, presided over by judges from hundreds of species who had suffered under hegemony rule. The punishment for the worst offenders wasn't death or imprisonment, but something far more appropriate. They were required to spend the rest of their lives helping rebuild the civilizations they had destroyed. 5 years after the Battle of Kepler, 442, Sarah Chen stood in a memorial garden on the world that had once been called New Terra, now renamed HFY, in honor of the species whose sacrifice had made galactic freedom possible. Around her, beings from across the galaxy gathered to remember the friends they had lost and celebrate the civilization they had built together. The memorial itself was a work of art that no single species could have created alone. HFY architectural principles provided the flowing, organic structure that seemed to grow from the Earth itself. Vorthai engineering ensured that every element was perfectly balanced and functional. Zeftic aesthetic sensibilities created harmonies of light and sound that spoke to emotional centers across dozens of different neural architectures. But the words carved into the memorial's central pillar were pure humanity. In memory of Dr. Foch, Tal Shan and all the HFY people who taught us that gratitude is the foundation of civilization. They showed kindness to strangers who could do nothing for them in return. In their honor, we swear that no species shall ever again face extinction alone. No cry for help shall go unanswered, and no act of kindness shall be forgotten. Below those words, translated into the languages of over 300 species, was the promise that had become the founding principle of galactic civilization. Humanity never forgets a kind deed. Sarah smiled as she watched children from dozens of species playing together in the memorial gardens, speaking hybrid languages that their parents could barely understand, solving problems through cooperation that would have been impossible under hegemony rule. They were growing up in a galaxy where different wasn't dangerous, where helping strangers was normal, where the greatest strength came not from weapons or technology, but from the simple willingness to stand together against darkness. Somewhere in the ruins of the old hegemony, there were still species struggling with the transition from slavery to freedom. There were worlds that needed rebuilding, refugees who needed homes, and conflicts that required resolution through patience rather than force. The galaxy was far from perfect, and probably always would be. But never again would a distress call go unanswered because someone decided that the victims weren't worth saving. Never again would entire civilizations be allowed to die alone in the dark while others looked away. Humanity had learned the lesson that Dr. Talshin tried to teach them. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from refusing to abandon friends. The galaxy had changed forever, and it had all started with a simple decision that some debts could only be paid by changing the universe itself.